King Thalos of Valerian stood on the silent balcony of his palace, staring out at the endless sky filled with the distant glow of dying stars. Once a proud ruler of one of the galaxy's most powerful empires, he now resembled nothing more than a hollow shell, a father stripped of purpose. The war with the human-led coalition had ended in fire, destruction, and unimaginable loss. Among the millions of casualties, none cut deeper than the loss of his only daughter, Princess Virel, whose ship was destroyed during a retreat over the burning world of Velmara. No survivors, no signal, just ash and silence. In the months that followed, monuments were built across the capital, carved in her image, surrounded by flickering blue crystals of mourning. Every day, Thalos walked past them without a word, without a tear. He had not spoken her name since the day of the explosion. The High Council offered their condolences, the people wept, but no one dared speak of the deep change in their king. He no longer attended ceremonies, ignored calls from allies, and let others manage diplomacy. All that remained was a ruler trapped in the past. Reliving the moment, he felt her presence vanish. But far from the royal halls, in a shattered forest, on the neutral moon of Varnik, life stirred beneath the rubble of a half-buried shuttle. Virel's fingers clawed through the scorched soil, weak and trembling, but alive. Her skin was torn, her breathing shallow, but her heart still beat. Somehow, she had survived, and she wasn't alone. A human soldier, also wounded, knelt beside her, offering a container of water. His armor was cracked, his helmet gone, and his arm bandaged with torn cloth, but his eyes were steady. He didn't speak her language, and she didn't speak his. But in that moment, they understood each other, enemies by fate, allies by survival. His name was Darian, and he had chosen not to leave her behind. Together, they hid from scanning drones, gathered supplies from wreckage, and built shelter beneath the trees. Virel did not know why he helped her, and Darian could not explain why he refused to walk away. But every day they endured one Ilari, princess, and one human soldier bonded not by politics, but by the simple will to live. Meanwhile, the galaxy moved on, thinking the war was truly over. Yet on Varnik, a quiet story began to form, one that would shake the peace built on ashes. Virel was no longer the same person. The war had carved scars deeper than skin, but it had also opened her eyes. She had seen hate, loss, and death, but now she saw something else: human compassion. Something she had been told did not exist. As days turned to weeks, and their strength returned, the question grew louder in her mind. What if she could return home? What if her people knew the truth? But her name was already written on a tomb, her voice silenced by fire. And even if she made it back, would they believe her? Would her father see her for who she had become, or only as a memory that didn't match the girl he had lost? And what would he do when he saw her standing beside a human? The forest winds carried no answers, only whispers of a future both uncertain and dangerous. But Virel knew one thing: the war had ended her old life, but not her story. And now, with Darian beside her, she was ready to return and face a galaxy that had already buried her. Da or Ia and Nox had never imagined his mission would end like this, stranded on a forgotten moon, far from any human base, hiding in a broken forest with the princess of the very race he had fought against. His orders were long gone, his team wiped out during the final battle, and now the only thing keeping him alive was instinct and the strange alliance he had formed with Virel, the lost daughter of the Ilari king. Each day on Varnik was a test of endurance and trust. The moon's skies were often filled with the soft hum of scout drones, and their light swept across the tree canopy like silent hunters. Darian had built a shelter using broken panels and heat shields from the wreckage, covering it with leaves and dirt to keep it hidden. He had salvaged what little food he could, learned to hunt small creatures with sharpened rods, and ration water from a nearby spring. But the hardest part wasn't surviving the elements, it was understanding the quiet alien beside him. Virel spoke in soft clicks and tones, gestures shaped by a culture he barely knew. yet her eyes said everything. She was strong, but wounded, brave, but unsure. And though they had come from two enemy worlds, there was something in the way she watched him curious, questioning, even thankful. Darien had treated her injuries, wrapped her arm, shared his last medical supplies. He had pulled her out from under a burning beam when the shelter caught fire during a lightning storm. In return, she had warned him of poisonous plants, hidden him from passing patrols, and once even shielded him from a falling predator with her own body. They were no longer soldier and captive. They were two people in the ruins of a war, holding on to whatever hope remained, but that hope was fragile. One night, as Darien was setting a trap, he spotted movement across the hill fast, smooth, deliberate. A bounty hunter, likely hired to trace war criminals or royal secrets, had arrived on Varnick. Darien knew the type: cold, deadly, and always watching. If they were found, they would be dragged away, or worse. He rushed back to Virel, signaling silently, and they began to move. No words were needed. They packed quickly and left the shelter behind, venturing deeper into the dark woods. For 2 days, they traveled without sleep, taking hidden paths, crossing ravines, and staying low beneath thorny roots. Rain fell on the 3rd day, heavy and cold, masking their scent and giving them a brief chance to breathe. In a cave high, on a cliffside, they rested. Virel leaned against the wall, her eyes heavy with pain. Darien handed her a cloth-wrapped bundle of dry food, and she gave a tired smile. The moment was quiet, but the danger was not gone. The bounty hunter had left signs: burned branches, deep boot prints, and the distinct marks of a plasma rifle. Darien checked his own weapon, low on charge, barely able to fire more than one blast. If they were caught, they had no backup, but he refused to give up. He had already made his choice when he first saw Virel under that rubble. He would protect her, not because of duty, but because it was the right thing to do. She wasn't his enemy anymore. She was someone who had lost everything, just like him. And in her presence, he had found a reason to keep fighting, not for war, but for survival, for peace, maybe even redemption. As dawn rose on the 4th day, the hunter made his move, setting off a sensor trap near their trail. Darien reacted fast, grabbing Virel's hand and pulling her into a stream. They ran, dodging fallen trees and jumping over rocks, their breath sharp and desperate. Behind them, the hum of the hunter's boots grew louder. Then came the shot, a blast of heat that missed them by inches, searing a hole into a tree. Darien turned and fired, his single shot striking the ground near the hunter, forcing him to duck. It wasn't enough to win, but enough to escape. They dove into a crevice, sliding down into darkness as the rain returned, flooding the path and washing away their tracks. For hours, they stayed in the cold tunnel beneath the rocks, listening for footsteps that never came. When the silence returned, and they finally climbed out into the foggy forest, Virel looked at Darien and placed her hand gently on his shoulder. It wasn't a gesture from a princess or an alien warrior. It was something human: thankfulness, trust, maybe even friendship. The moon of Varnick had nearly killed them, but it had also changed them. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were something stronger, and somewhere, beyond the stars, the galaxy believed the war was over, that the dead remained dead, that peace had settled. But they were wrong, because the lost Alari princess was still alive, and she was walking beside a human who had protected her not out of duty, but from something far deeper. And now, they both knew what they had to do: find a way off the moon, return to Alarion, and face a world that was not ready for what they had become. The skies above Varnick were dark with storm clouds when Virel and Darien finally reached the old emergency beacon tower, buried deep in the forest, half broken and overgrown with vines, its signal dish twisted from years of neglect. It was their last hope, the only way to send a call for help, and even that was a gamble. Darien worked quickly, stripping wires and rerouting circuits with shaking hands, while Virel stood watch, her keen eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of the bounty hunter who still hunted them. Every rustle of leaves made her heart race. Every distant sound could be danger. But time was running out. The food was gone, their energy low, and their bodies bruised from days of running and hiding. Darien finally managed to power up the beacon, its lights flickering as a weak signal began pulsing into the sky. Varel entered an emergency code. Only her people would recognize a secret royal distress signal, not used since the days before the war. Now all they could do was wait. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the hum of the machine and the quiet patter of rain. Then, just before dawn, the beacon blinked green. A ship had received the call. It was coming. But who was it? Friend or foe? They had no way of knowing. Darien stayed alert, holding his weapon tightly, and Virel gripped a broken spear she had carved herself. When the ship arrived, it was not what either of them expected. Sleek, dark, and bearing the royal crest of Valerian, it hovered silently above the trees before slowly landing in the clearing. Virel's breath caught in her throat. It was a royal recovery ship, one only used for high-value targets or family members. The doors opened, and armored guards stepped out, weapons lowered but ready. Then came the voice an old friend of the family, Captain Arvian, a man Virel had known since childhood. His eyes widened when he saw her, and for a long moment he simply stared. She was thinner, battle-scarred, wearing human gear and standing beside a soldier from Earth, but she was alive. "Princess Virel?" he asked softly, his voice uncertain. She nodded. "I'm alive," she said, "and I need you to take us home." The word "us" did not go unnoticed. Arvian's gaze moved to Darien, whose weapon remained lowered but ready. "He saved my life," Virel added quickly. "He is not a prisoner. He is my protector." Arvian hesitated but gave the signal to stand down. The guards moved aside, and the pair stepped aboard the ship. As the engines lifted them into the clouds, Virel looked down at the moon where she had nearly died and where something new had been born, trust between enemies. The journey to Ilarion was tense. Virel tried to prepare herself for what came next. Her father, King Thalos, had mourned her, buried her in spirit, and built a world without her. How would he react to seeing her alive? And what would he say when he saw her arrive with a human at her side? The palace loomed as beautiful and cold as she remembered, its towers rising through the mist like silent watchers. The landing pad was surrounded by guards, advisors, and nobles summoned by news of the impossible Princess Virel had returned. As she stepped out of the ship, the air fell still. Then the crowd parted, and her father appeared. His golden robe dragged along the floor, and his silver crown seemed heavier than before. His eyes locked on hers, unblinking, and for a long time he did not move. He looked at her like a ghost. Slowly, Virel walked toward him, her heart pounding. She removed her helmet, letting the wind move through her tangled hair, and stood still, in front of the man who had once carried her as a child. "Father," she said, voice trembling. Thalos took a breath, then another, before stepping forward and touching her face gently, as if to make sure she was real. "You are alive," he whispered. "But how?" She turned slightly, gesturing to Darien, who stood behind her, surrounded by guards but unafraid. "Because of him," she said. "He saved me, he protected me. I would not be standing here without him." Murmurs swept through the crowd like a sudden wind. A human, standing beside the princess. Thalos's face was hard to read, part disbelief, part awe, and something else deeper. "He is our enemy," one of the nobles hissed. "He is a soldier of the coalition," but Virel stood tall. "Not anymore," she said. "Not to me." Thalos looked at Darien, then back to his daughter. Silence fell again, long and heavy. Then the king gave a quiet nod and turned to the guards. "No chains," he said. "Let him be." The crowd gasped. Virel smiled for the first time in weeks. She had returned home not just to survive, but to change something greater. She had seen what war did, what hate could become, and now she carried a new truth. Peace was not made with weapons, but with choices, and she had made hers. But, even as the palace gates opened and the people of Valerian saw their lost princess rise from the ashes, shadows still lingered. Not everyone would welcome her return. Not everyone would accept a human at her side. And somewhere, deep in the void, the hunter who had failed to capture her was already reporting to someone else, someone who would not rest until the secret alliance between a princess and a human was buried forever. The grand halls of Valerian were filled with whispers and stares as Princess Virel walked beside Darien through the ancient corridors, their presence sparking silent tension that clung to the air like smoke after battle. And though the king had welcomed them, the court was not so easily convinced, for the wounds of war were still fresh in the minds of many. And the idea that a human, once an enemy soldier, could walk freely inside the palace felt like a threat to tradition and pride. Even among her own people, Virel felt the cold edge of doubt. But she stood firm, knowing that trust could not be given, only earned, and that truth must rise even when covered in centuries of hate. So, when the royal council demanded a trial, a test of truth and loyalty, Virel accepted without fear. And Darien, ever beside her, nodded his quiet support, knowing the path ahead would be dangerous, not just for him, but for both of them. The trials of truth were ancient, designed to break lies through pressure, pain, and fear, not by weapons, but by exposing the soul. And so the first trial began in the Hall of Memories, where glowing stones showed moments from Darien's past, his training, his missions, his battles against the Alar people, and the images struck hard, especially when they showed him firing upon Alar scouts, and the council gasped. But Darien did not flinch, instead stepping forward and speaking with steady words, explaining that he had once followed orders blindly, like many do in war. But his heart had changed when he saw the truth, when he realized that enemies were people, not monsters, and that saving Virel had changed his soul forever. Still, not all were moved, and the second trial brought even more challenge, for it took them to the pit of judgment, a dark chamber where voices of the dead echoed through holograms, forcing Darien to face the families of those who had died in the war. And as the illusions wept and shouted, Darien dropped to his knees, his voice breaking as he admitted he could not undo the past, but he would spend his life making sure such hatred would never return. And in that moment, even the hardest-hearted noble paused, struck by his raw truth. But the third trial was the most dangerous, one that Virel had not expected, the test of allegiance, where Darien was taken without warning and dropped into the middle of a simulation that mimicked war, forced to choose between saving Ilari children or returning to Virel's side while a countdown ticked and fire spread around him, and the watchers in the royal court held their breath as the projection played, showing Darien rushing into the flames, shielding the young with his own body, dragging them out one by one until he collapsed. And when the simulation ended and he awoke burned and breathless, the silence in the court was deeper than before. Still, one voice remained bitter: Lord Varenth, the king's top advisor, who accused Darien of trickery, of playing the hero to gain influence. And when he demanded the final test, even the king hesitated, but Virel stepped forward and declared she would take the test too, for trust was a bond forged by two, not one. And so the final trial was set, the circle of revelation, where both Virel and Darien would be connected through the mind gate, their thoughts exposed, their fears and feelings laid bare before the council and the king. They stood together, the gate buzzing with energy, and as the light surrounded them, their memories flowed: Virel's fear of being forgotten, Darien's pain from the war, their quiet moments hiding under alien stars, the nights they watched each other silently, protecting one another without needing words. And suddenly, the council saw not just a soldier and a princess, but two souls scarred by war and bound by truth. When the light faded, there was no sound, no question, only the deep breath of a father who finally saw beyond titles. And King Thalos rose from his throne and said only one thing: truth has been shown. And with that, the trials ended, and while not every heart changed that day, a seed was planted, one that would grow with time, for even in the face of hate and doubt, truth had found a voice, and it spoke through the bond of a daughter once lost and a human who never gave up on her. The palace of Valerian had never been so quiet, even in its deepest halls, where echoes of ancient kings still lived in the walls. But now a different kind of silence filled the air, one born not from peace, but from uncertainty, because for the first time in the history of the Star Kingdom, a human had passed the trials of truth and stood not as a prisoner, not as an enemy, but as someone invited to stand beside the royal bloodline. And while the king had accepted the truth of Virel and Darian's bond, the people outside the walls were not so easily convinced. Protests rose in the lower cities, nobles whispered in shadowed rooms, and even some of the king's own guard questioned whether this moment was the start of unity or betrayal. But King Thalos remained firm, watching his daughter with both pride and fear, for he knew her heart burned with a new vision, one not of revenge or glory, but of peace, and peace was always the hardest path to walk. Now the king faced a choice, one that could decide the future of Valerian forever: name his daughter the heir, as was her birthright, and in doing so also welcome Darian to a seat of power, or choose tradition and risk losing her again, this time not to war, but to a broken dream. And so he called for a final assembly, the great gathering, where every clan leader, every noble house, and every citizen representative would witness his decision and judge it with their own eyes. The throne room was filled with tension. Thousands gathered inside and millions more watching from across the stars as King Thalos stepped forward, dressed not in gold, but in the armor he once wore during the last battle of the war, a silent message to all that this moment was not about ceremony, but survival. Beside him stood Virel, calm but strong, her scars no longer hidden, and Darian beside her in a simple tunic, no weapons, no armor, just truth. The king raised his hand, and the room fell into silence as he spoke of loss, of war, of how hatred had burned through generations, and how even he, a father who thought his daughter had died, had learned that the past must not chain the future. And then he said the words no one expected: the throne must belong to the one who carries the future, not the past. And that is my daughter, Princess Virel. And a wave of shock swept through the crowd. But the king wasn't done, for he turned to Darian and said, and if she is to lead, then her protector must be trusted, not as an outsider, but as one of us. And the room exploded with noise, some cheering, others shouting, and in the chaos, Lord Varenth rose again, his voice sharp and dangerous, claiming that a human at the side of the throne would lead to ruin, to weakness, and he demanded that Darian step aside and return to Earth, or risk open rebellion. The moment hung in the air like a blade, and even the guards waited, unsure if this would end with words or blood. But Darian, calm as ever, stepped forward and spoke not with pride, but with truth, saying he had no desire to rule, no hunger for power, only the promise he made to protect Virel, no matter what, even if that meant walking away. And his words rang clear, not as a soldier, but as a man who had seen too much death to ever chase a crown. Virel turned to her father and said quietly, I do not need him to sit beside me, I need him to stand beside me. And Thalos understood, nodding slowly before declaring that Darian would be given the title of shield-bearer of the crown, a role of honor, not of rule, but of eternal protection, and with it he would be bound to the safety of the realm and its heir. This time, the court did not shout, for even the harshest doubters could not deny what they saw: a warrior who asked for nothing but gave everything. The days that followed were tense, with small riots and angry protests, but Virel walked among her people without guards, speaking openly, listening carefully, and slowly the fire cooled, the anger softened, and the people saw her not as a princess who returned from the dead, but as a leader reborn with new strength. Darian trained with the royal guard, taught them earth tactics, and in time earned not their love, but their respect. When the time came, the coronation was simple, not grand. Virel placed her hand upon the ancient orb of unity, and the light that rose did not reject her, but glowed brighter than it had in generations, a sign to all that the throne had accepted her. And as she turned to the crowd, with Darien behind her and her father watching proudly, she spoke not of victory, but of future, of a new world where human and Alari could build together, fight side by side not in war, but for peace. And far away, in the cold dark of space, unseen enemies watched, fearful, for they knew what was rising in Alarion was not just a new queen, but a new era, and the human standing beside her was proof that the galaxy would never be the same again.